Okay, so in this video, we're going to cover the material on growth theory. We've talked about how we measure growth, taking a simple percentage change in GDP or GDP per capita. We looked at the historical perspective, noting that economic growth as we know it today is relatively modern. It's only been happening for about 200 years. And we talked about the difference between economic divergence and convergence. So divergence when different countries grow at different rates or they start growing at different times, and then convergence when the countries that started later or were growing slower start to catch up. And so now we want to ask, what actually allows a country to grow? What actually allows a country to produce more in goods and services over time? And some of these kind of growth factors we've already talked about with respect to our PPF model. So real quickly, three of the things that we know allow countries to grow is an increase in the quantity of resources they have. So they find a way to get their hands on more land, labor, and capital. The second factor is an increase in the quality of resources. So they find a way to take their existing land, labor, and capital and make them better. And then third, just an increase in technology. So the means by which we take resources and combine them into goods and services. So if we can, find a way to make a change in any of those three areas, then, in theory, we should be able to grow our economy, produce more goods and services. Now, in the past century, there's been a lot more focus on two other factors. One is productivity. And productivity is simply taking a measure of how much output you produce relative to how much input you put into the production process. So if you can find a way to measure output over input, then you're measuring productivity. And so when it comes to productivity, there are two things that we might hope to achieve. We might hope to take the same number of inputs and use them a different way to produce more output, right? That will allow us to produce more goods and services. Or alternatively, we might be able to find a way to take or to produce the same amount of input but using fewer resources. And if we can do that, then that means we have resources left over that we can then use to make some other good and service. And then finally, another thing that allows countries to grow is the creation and the transmission and the use of knowledge and information. And so remember when we talked about economic divergence, we said it kind of got kickstarted around 1800 during the Industrial Revolution in places like England and the United States. So what was going on is that people had new ideas about how to produce things, and they utilized that information. Well, it took time for some of those ideas and knowledge information to spread to other parts of the world, which is one reason why other parts of the world didn't start growing as quickly. So when it comes to information, first you have to think up an idea. You have to create the information. Next, you have to be able to transmit that information. And it turns out that even 200 years ago, it took a long time to send information from one part of the globe to another. You literally had to write a letter, and put it on a boat and sail it across the ocean. But as we developed steam power and locomotives, and then the telegraph wire, and then cars and telephone lines, and now the internet, it's now much easier to transmit information from one place to another. But getting your hands on the information isn't enough because you have to be able to actually use that information once you've acquired it. So you may send, the idea of how to build a steam engine to somebody in another country, but they may not have the tools and resources necessary to actually make the steam engine. And so again, it takes time for us to be able to move resources and other capital goods from one place to another so that the people on the receiving end of that information can actually put that information to use. And so again, with advances in transportation, it's a lot easier to move physical resources and capital around the world. So those are the kind of five factors that lead to growth. So more resources, better technology, an increase in productivity, and an increase in the creation, transmission, and utilization of information. Now, beyond that, there are some other ingredients that are necessary for a country to be able to grow. And these are going to be things that kind of create the right conditions that will allow individuals and firms within a society to get more, better resources, improve productivity, improve transmission use of knowledge. And so these are what I like to call, kind of my ingredients for growth. So one of the first things we see in countries that are growing is that they have high quality public capital and infrastructure. And you may recall that we've discussed that infrastructure is things like roads and bridges, electric grids, dams, water and sewer lines, or rail lines. So these form kind of the backbone of the economy, and they help us, power our houses and factories with electricity, and then move goods and services around, move resources around. And so typically that's going to be something that a government provides, whether it's a city, state, or federal government. And that's why we sometimes refer to that as public capital, because things like roads and bridges and electric grids and sewer lines, those help us produce other goods and services. So that's the first ingredient, is public capital infrastructure. Something else that we typically see is necessary is a strong legal system. So we want to make sure that there's a system in place that first recognizes and then protects and enforces property rights. So the owners of land, labor, and capital know that they can make use of those resources without, having to worry about it being stolen or someone using it without their permission. And then also a system of contract, so that I can sign a contract to let someone else use my resource for a period of time and they'll compensate me. And then if someone violates the contract or tries to take my property, there's a system in place where we can go to court and receive justice. So a strong legal system, a way to resolve disputes, is going to help people and firms engage in more activity, economic activity. In addition to a legal system, we like to see a strong financial system. So we'll talk about money and banking later on and how money serves as a medium of exchange. But without a safe place to keep your money, or perhaps a place to go and borrow money if you need to buy something or start a business, it's going to be a lot more difficult for your economy to grow. So a strong and stable financial system that people trust, and a strong and stable legal system that people trust. Now the legal system is most likely to be set up and run by government, but the financial system, as we'll see later, is largely in private hands, but government still may play a role in making sure that there are fair rules and regulations to ensure that no one person takes advantage of another. Now another ingredient is education, in particular public education. So, there is private education and there have been schools for a very long time, but as far as public education, this is still a relatively recent development, but we recognize that with more widely available public education, adequately funded public education, that's going to improve over time the quality of your labor force. And so, again, government, can step in and through a local school district set up a school system to educate people, and that's going to allow the people within that community to tap into a more experienced, more knowledgeable labor force. And then literacy, especially, because when it comes to transmitting and utilizing information, it helps if you have more people that can actually read that information. So trying to ensure a high rate of literacy, which comes as a part of education, is going to be a big boost to growth. Now, one last thing, or next to last thing, is trade. So at the end of the semester, we'll develop a simple model of international trade. And so we're going to see how two countries that voluntarily trade with one another are able to experience growth. Not necessarily because they produce more within their country, but through specialization, countries can specialize in one good or another, trade it to another country, and receive more of something in return. So we'll discuss that in more detail. But typically, countries that open their borders to trade will experience higher rates of growth. And of course, government, again, is going to play a role in kind of overseeing, to make sure that, the trade is fair, or that, bad things aren't coming or going. Now, kind of the linchpin that ties all of these together, the public capital, the legal, the financial systems, public education, and free trade, free open trade, what ties it all together is government. And so it turns out that in a lot of cases in countries that aren't experiencing economic growth, one thing you can point to is the fact that they don't have governments that are very strong. In a lot of places, governments may be corrupt, or people don't trust the government. And if you don't have, a good, stable, trustworthy system of governance in place, it's going to be very difficult for that society to provide itself with education and roads and bridges and legal and financial systems, which then is going to make it a lot harder for people and firms within that society to get more resources, better resources, improve their technology, improve their productivity, or develop and spread new information. And so when we consider, why some countries have strong governments, governments that people trust, governments that truly care for their people and provide them with public goods and services, we have to look to history. And in a lot of cases, we may see that some countries, such as Western European countries and the United States to some extent, functioned as colonial powers or imperial powers, which meant they controlled a lot of other parts of the world, especially in Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia. And so what we see happening then is, those countries in Western Europe extract resources from their colonies. They may come in and set up some new businesses, but of course those are going to be run by, residents, citizens of the colonial powers. And so, in a sense, we see, the local population not really having much of a say in how the resources are utilized, because the colonial power may just come in and, extract the resources for themselves and leave the locals with not much. And as we've seen more and more independence movements over the past century, you see local populations, basically kicking the colonial powers out, and they say, okay, we're going to run our own country now. A lot of what's lacking in these countries is good governance. They're just people don't trust the government, or the government may not necessarily always act in the interest of society as a whole. And in a lot of those cases, things like roads and bridges aren't going to be built or aren't going to be maintained. There may not be widespread public education or literacy. There may not be a strong legal or financial system. And as a result, you're going to see a lot less economic activity taking places in those countries. Now, beyond history, we can look at different social or cultural factors, different religious or ethnic factors. There's a whole lot that goes into determining whether any single country, any single society, is going to be able to achieve any sustainable or meaningful growth for itself. And so we can't, just point the finger at one factor or another and say that's why this country is growing and that one country is not growing. There's a lot of factors involved, and as economists, we have to make sure that we are accounting for all those factors and that we have a solid understanding of how a country got to where it is today and why that country is growing, not growing, or something in between.